think I still see some folks. Ooh, that happened very quickly. I still see some folks trickling in, so I might just do a song and dance for y'all before we get started. Not going to actually do that, but I appreciate the enthusiasm. We do still have some people trickling in, but that's okay. We're going ahead and get started because I got a lot of information to get through today, and I don't want to keep you here until 5. I think you would all agree that that might not be fun for any of us. So with that, welcome to the second ever Taylor Talks. My name is Alexandra McKinney, for those of you who don't know who I am. I am the Instructional Coordinator Supervisor here at the Taylor-Mesilla Historic Site. And I am thrilled to have you all here. If this is your first Taylor Talks, this is a quarterly series that we just began here at the site. They will continue to happen here in the Mesilla Community Center, which we're really grateful to the Community Center for providing that, the town. And that's because there have been so many of you who have been coming to these events that we can't actually fit it in the rental store, so we are having to hold it here in the Community Center, which is fantastic. So thank you all for coming to these. We are right now in a 4-part kind of mini introductory series that's introducing what the Taylor-Mesilla Historic Site is. This is part 2 today, and then once we finish those 4 parts, we will kind of expand and broaden our horizons and learn about history and stories that relate to not just the Taylor-Mesilla Historic Site, but Mesilla Valley and the southern New Mexico. I should turn this on. That would be helpful. So in part 1, we talked about what is the Taylor-Mesilla Historic Site. We covered a history of the town of Mesilla, how the home became a historic site, and then what the state of New Mexico is currently up to in preparing to open this site as a publicly opened day-to-day historic site, which is scheduled to happen in the fall of 2025. That talk, if you missed that talk, is currently on the New Mexico Historic Sites YouTube channel, so please definitely go take a look at that if you missed it, and it might kind of fill in some gaps that we will discuss just a little bit today. For the rest of this 4-part mini-series, part 3 will then come on April 19th, and it will cover the J. Paul and Mary Daniels Taylor papers. Dennis Daly, who is here today, will be leading that discussion. He is an archivist at New Mexico State University, and he will talk about the relationship between the Taylor family and the Rio Grande Historical Collection, as well as Mary's commitment to historical research. And then part 4 of this mini-series will take place July 19th, and it will introduce you to the Taylor family from the Taylor family. So that will actually be led by Mike Taylor, Pat Taylor, and Mary Helen Taylor Raichie. So you'll get to meet Mary and Paul and the whole family, hear their story from the family, and why they made the decision to donate the home. Today, though, oh boy, we got a lot to cover, so hold on to your hats and bear with me, everybody. We are talking about the Taylor family home and the collection inside. It's a lot. I probably should have broken this up into 2, but hindsight is 2020, and here we are. We are going to start with what is territorial architecture, then we'll cover the home. I'll introduce it to you, give you its layout and some of the key places that you need to know going forward. Then we'll talk about a chronology of the home's development, how the home went from what it was in the 1850s into the home that we see today. We'll talk about just some of the preservation work that the Taylor family did over the years, and then we're going to shift gears and talk about the incredible Taylor family collection. That will be a huge flyby because by the time we get to that point, there will be like 4 minutes left in our time today. And at the end of all of this, we'll wrap it up and we'll talk a little bit about house museums and what all of this means for the site going forward. So, Taylor-Mesilla Historic Site consists of a private residence and 2 commercial storefronts. You can see we have this really fabulous wall mount that was installed in our visitor center right now, which lays out exactly each of these pieces. So these pieces consist of the rental store, which is right there. This is the visitor center of the Taylor-Mesilla Historic Site. This is how you will enter the site going forward. On the other side is the Barella store, and this is going to be the gift shop that the Friends of the Taylor-Mesilla Historic Site host once the site is open on its whole. And then right in the center here, we have what we refer to as the plaza door or the zaguan door, and I'll talk a little more about a zaguan in just a few minutes. And this is the entrance to the Taylor family home. So those are the 3 buildings that constitute that property. The Taylor family, I'm going to turn this just a little bit so I can see it better. The Taylor family is led by the incomparable J. Paul and Mary Daniels Taylor. They lived in that plaza property for 70 years. Paul and Mary Taylor really worked hard to forward history and education, particularly of Mesilla in southern New Mexico. And they also amassed this phenomenal collection of art and artifacts that not only highlighted the different types of artists that we have here in Las Cruces and the Mesilla Valley, but this art comes from all over the world. By the turn of the 21st century, knowing the work that they had put into preserving their home, knowing the collection that they had, they made the decision alongside their 7 children to donate the home, the 2 attached storefronts, and the collection to the state of New Mexico to be a state historic site, with the intention that this site would forward that mission into perpetuity of teaching about southern New Mexico and the art inside the home. J. Paul and Mary Daniels Taylor retained a life tenancy in the home, so despite the fact that the house was designated a historic site in 2004, the family remained in the home, and Mrs. Taylor passed away in 2007, and then Mr. Taylor passed away in 2023, and that then set off this chain of events, bringing us to where we are now in getting that site publicly open. So, with that, let's talk a little bit about territorial architecture. This is really kind of important overview of kind of key things that you need to know before we kind of move into the buildings, because even before moving inside the buildings, when you look at this historic site as well as the properties all across the Mesilla Plaza, what you're going to notice is that they can teach us a lot about the types of architecture that was really prominent in southern New Mexico during the years that the New Mexico was a U.S. territory, meaning 1850 to 1912. This is why it's called territorial architecture. These buildings are classified, they were typically 1 story tall. They were on these kind of long, narrow house lots, which is a little different than what we might see today with them being in a more square lot. But the reason why they were in these longer lots is because there was a lot more buildings that were involved in this process. It usually wasn't just one building that made up the entire house. There was usually outbuildings like granaries or bathrooms or kitchens or stables. So there was a lot of buildings that had to be on these properties. And these buildings were also generally pretty close to the property line. These buildings were also made of adobe, typically. Adobe is a very common style of building material here in southern New Mexico. It's actually a very common building style around the world. In fact, 1 out of every 3 people live in a house that is made out of dirt. Adobe is a building material that's usually called mud brick sometimes. It's got sand, water, clay, and usually an organic material like straw or manure in it. They're very strong bricks, but they're also very high maintenance bricks. This is a type of building material that you have to maintain and keep up with. And if you don't, because they're made out of natural materials, eventually erosion like wind or water will turn it back into those natural elements. But on the flip side, they are a very strong building material, and they're a really great building material because, first of all, it's a common one that you can find here, which is typically the type of houses that people built is based on the type of building material that was around. But in addition to that, they have these really thick walls that provide for maximum insulation and work on a very kind of simple explanation, kind of like a swamp cooler on the most moderate of days. They can keep your house warm in the winter and cool in the summer. Territorial architecture is an adaptation of the very popular Greek revival style, which around the Civil War era was very popular, but starting to wane in its popularity along the East Coast. But as it was waning in popularity along the East Coast, it was rising in popularity here in the western part of the United States. It's characterized a lot by these very flat roofs that you can see here. These flat roofs generally have an incline that will allow for drainage, and there's parapets on all 3 sides. These parapets are also usually capped with some kind of brick or masonry. You can actually see right up here at the very top, there's some capping there. And then they're also stuccoed with a lime or plastering or some kind of mud stuccoing. In addition to that, we have windows and doors that are very flush with the outside of the walls, and we have a lot of times these portals. This is actually the interior courtyard of the Taylor family home, but it's got this portal right here, which I think is really beautiful, and I just decided to use that as the example. But we do have portals on the Mesilla Plaza. Double Eagle has one right out in front, and then Thunderbird Mesilla has one as well. So again, very quick introduction to territorial architecture. I do want to point out that if this is something that you are interested in, as a topic you want to learn more about, Daniel Webb, who's one of our interpretive rangers, he's actually giving a program at the end of this month that is specifically dedicated to territorial architecture. It'll include a lecture as well as a walking tour of Mesilla. So if you want more information about that, let me know at the end of this chat. All right. So, there's a reason why a lot of our publicity refers to this property as a rambling adobe home. This is the floor plan of the Taylor-Mesilla Historic Site. And we're going to keep coming back to this over and over and over again throughout our talk. And so I do want to kind of place us where we are in this. Down at the bottom here is where the Mesilla Plaza is located. This right here is the rental store. That is, once again, our visitor center. And then on the other side is the Barella store, where the gift shop will eventually be. This right here is that Zaguan hallway that I mentioned. And the reason why these Zaguans work, I'm actually going to go back and show you this picture. This is the Zaguan right here. This is that hallway. So there's that plaza door. This door right here out in front. And the reason why these Zaguans existed is because, again, like I said, they were these long, narrow lots where people would live behind their storefront. So you'd have your storefront out facing the plaza, and then you would live back behind it. And so when you go behind the two storefronts on the plaza, you reach all of these buildings which are back there. This is what's going to open in the fall of 2025, and we are very excited about it. So I'm going to break this up into a couple of sections, and then we're going to talk about them more individually. All along this side is what we refer to as the north side of the house. If you've ever been on a tour of the Taylor-Mesilla Historic Site with me, or in the future when you go on a tour with either one of our rangers or a docent, you're going to enter the house through this door right here, which is directly behind the Barella store, and enter into this northern section of the home. This section was very heavily impacted by Charles Reynolds, which we'll get to in a little bit. And then you can kind of move back into the rest of the house that direction. The other way that you can enter into the house is if you keep going back through the Zaguan and straight into the inner courtyard. This is the inner courtyard. I showed you pictures of that just a few minutes ago. You can keep going straight through the inner courtyard and into what we then refer to as the small Zaguan. It is a hallway right here that we're going to talk a lot about here in just a little bit that will allow you to access not just the north side of the house right here, but the back rooms of the house right over here, as well as this L-shaped section right here, which all of these are spaces that we're going to get to. I really don't want to overwhelm you and name all of the pieces, so I'm trying to make this as simple as possible. But like I said, we're going to keep coming back to this, and once the home is open, it'll probably become a little more clear to everybody, but for now, hopefully that made just a little bit of sense. Okay, so now what we'll do is we'll go through the chronology of the development of the home. And we're going to do this in a similar fashion to what I did with part one, where we go through the individual families who lived in the property through history. But rather than talking about the family's history, today I want to talk about how they impacted the development of the site. I do, though, want to introduce you first to the Historic Structures Report. I call this the Bible. And this is a 500-page tome which tells you everything that you need to know about the structures at the Taylor-Mesilla Historic Site. I want to introduce this to you because a lot of the diagrams that you're about to see, as well as most of the information that I give today, came from the Historic Structures Report. Either that or it came from Pat, who was very helpful in answering some questions for me. So thank you, Pat. All right, so we're going to start with the Barella family. This is not the first family to live in this section of the Mesilla Plaza in the early 1850s, but it is the first family that we talk about in relation to the Taylor-Mesilla Historic Site. Anastasio and Rafaela Barella moved into Mesilla in about 1853, and these buildings date to about 1857. This is why we refer to what is going to become the gift shop as the Barella store, because this storefront originally was a part of the storefront they had, and then the stretch of buildings behind that northern section that we're going to talk about in just a second belonged to them first. Now, on the left side, did I get that right? Left side, we have our floor plan here for the Taylor-Mesilla Historic Site. And then on the right, I put in a zoomed version of that northern section here because for the Barellas, this is the section that we really want to highlight. This was not the connected series of rooms that we see today, because if you can see, we've got room, 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 all the way back. When the Borellas first moved in, that's not what it looked like. They added to this space incrementally over time. It started with the buildings at the front here, and then the buildings at the back here. And there was this big gap of space right here, because again, as I mentioned, they had outbuildings. And so you didn't necessarily want your kitchen attached to the rest of the house if it could catch fire and then burn the rest of your property down. So you really did want the kitchen to be a separate building. And so they added incrementally over time, but what this did is it added a bit of a challenge for us from an interpretive standpoint, because what you'll notice is that there is no space, there's no hallways between these rooms. And so from an interpretive standpoint, when you go into the home, you can either see all of these rooms or none of these rooms. It also has a challenge for us from a facility standpoint, because all of the walls are actually different sizes, but that's part of what makes the house so very cool. And the other thing that I want to point out is all the way in the back here, this little room is going to become a really important room. This is what we call the wine room today. And so this is one of those outbuildings that originally was part of the Borella property. I'm going to keep coming back to this room, but it is called the wine room. Oh. Look at that, I circled that. Hey, and look, there's the wine room too. I forgot I did this. All right, so this is one of those diagrams that I mentioned comes from the Historic Structures Report. I did not create this, don't get excited about this. This did not come from me. But what you can see in it is that it shows us exactly how that development moved over time. So it's gonna get kind of exciting because they'll start to change color and overlay what buildings got added over time. Hopefully that'll help make things a little clearer. But once again, we've got the Borella store right here that was a part of that original building, and then some of these rooms in the back, including right there, the wine room. Now, one thing that I do want to point out on this kind of three-dimensional version here, this is not the Reynolds store. This is actually what is currently the bookstore. So we have this big gap of space right here where the blue tin facade building will eventually be, but wasn't at the time. So there is this big gap of space right here, nothing, 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 and then we have the Borella store right here. This piece right here, just to place you on the plaza, is that little archway that if you go next to the site, it has the altar that the Taylor family has set up for their mom and dad right in this little corner here. So that's this little archway right here. All right, so photos from the turn of the 20th century show a very different looking plaza than what we recognize today. Yeah, this is the Borella story, y'all. So what we can see there is that we've got smaller windows. Boy, that really surprised me. I didn't think there was going to be laughter for that. That turned me off a little bit. But this is actually right here. We've got the Borella door and the Zaguan door. There's not a lot of ornamentation in all of these buildings, and the windows are much smaller than they used to be. Come the turn of the century, I'm really sorry this photo is so blurry, just bear with me on this. We have right here, this is the original Reynolds and Briggs Mercantile. Now today, once again, this is the bookstore, but the Reynolds and Briggs Mercantile entered into Mesilla about 1863. Joseph Reynolds and J. Edgar Briggs were civilian employees with the U.S. Army who had a kind of significant mercantile empire all throughout southern New Mexico, and then they came in and built a store here in Mesilla. But this is not what I want to point out. What I want to point out is right over here on this side. So this is where that tin facade will ultimately get built, but it's not built quite yet. This right here is a part of the Borella's property in the back, and it just kind of adds to what I was talking about with these being buildings that were not connected to the rest of the buildings, because you can actually tell that there is a little bit of gap of space there. William Charles Reynolds comes into Mesilla in about 1900s. He decides that he wants to reinvigorate his father's mercantile empire. So he buys up property from the Briggs family, who continue to own the property that storefront was on, but he also buys out the property from the Borella family. And he institutes this really significant renovation project on the property. Again, he is very responsible for much of the look of the front of the property that we see today. This is why in the last talk I gave him all of that credit, because now we can start to see all of the different work that he did on the property. Now we can see that the blue tin facade is built. We've got this extended zaguan all the way back here. And all of this in the black dotted line, he did renovation work on this area here. Oops. So I've turned the model just a little bit to add them in the floor plan here, because what I want to point out is that he is responsible for adding this long hallway along that north side of the property right there, and I'll show you a picture of that in just a second. But the reason he did this is because, as I mentioned earlier, there was no access to those rooms without going through other rooms. And so by adding this hallway right here, you're able to get from this space to this space without going through these spaces right here. So he adds this very long hallway into that space. Another thing that he does is renovate the ceiling of this room. This is the sala, this is the parlor. If you go on a tour of the Taylor-Mesilla Historic Site in the future and you enter with a ranger guided tour or a docent guided tour, this is actually the first room that you're going to enter into. This is what we refer to again as the sala. And this used to have a Viga Latia ceiling on it. But Charles Reynolds removed that Viga Latia ceiling and he raised it and added this beadboard ceiling right here. The first 3 rooms of the home, if you go into this next room and the next room beyond that, they have that beadboard ceiling, and Charles Reynolds is the one who is responsible for that. Here is that long hallway that connects the sala all the way to the dining room, which is, if you go down these steps right over here, you'll enter into the dining room. Just as an aside, this painting right here is one of my very favorite pieces in the whole collection. One thing that's very cool about these additions that Charles Reynolds did to the interior home is that it gives us the ability to highlight the various cultures that had an impact on the preservation and the development of the home over time. Because adding this kind of hallway, it has less emphasis on that Hispanic communal style of living, and it's a more of an Anglo style addition that they would have added in order to give people their own private spaces. And so we have this ability through the architecture of the home to talk about why all the various cultures that came into this place changed New Mexico and created the New Mexico that we have today. He also added the pitched roof right here. If you look outside the front of the property today, or frankly along the north side of the property, you can see that the whole north section of the site has this tin pitched roof right here, and Charles Reynolds is responsible for that. Charles Reynolds spent a lot of money on these renovations and then had a couple of bad years of business. And because of that, he had to take out a loan from the local parish priest, Father Grange. And after about a decade, he was unable to pay back that loan. And so Father Grange foreclosed on the property. And so by 1914, Charles Reynolds has moved out of the property and Father Grange has moved into the property alongside his housekeeper, Valentina, and Valentina's daughter, Perla. And Father Grange remained in this property until his passing in 1936. Right here, we've got a picture of the plaza from the 1930s. We can now see the tin facade building right here, as well as the Zaguan door and the Barella store. Perla Aladib was willed the property from Father Grange upon his passing in 1936, and she continued to lease out the storefront to various proprietors. But the other thing that she did is that she placed partitions in the home, creating smaller leasable apartments, and rented those places out to tenants to help supplement her income. One thing I want to point out is that to the north of the Barella store, there is no storefront. So, of course, today we've got the little archway right here, and then beyond that is where Del Sol is currently. But at this time, that didn't exist there. And as a matter of fact, Father Grange had a vineyard where he grew grapes for church communion, and that is actually why the wine room is called the wine room. Because when the Taylor family moved into the home, there was a few casks of Father Grange's wine still in that room. In 1953, J. Paul and Mary Taylor made the first of what was ultimately 4 property purchases from Perla Aladib and moved their family into the home. Perla didn't end up going very far, as a matter of fact, so she kind of sold the property to the Taylors in sections, and what she did when she sold the home to the Taylors is she didn't leave the plaza. That section where Del Sol now is was originally her little house that she built when the Taylor family first moved into the property. The Taylors had a lot of work that they had to do to make this livable for their families. When they moved in 1953, they had 3 children, and by the end of the year, they would have had their 4th child. And so there was a lot they needed to do to make sure that they could comfortably raise their family in this space. Now, because of the varying degrees of structural integrity in the home, particularly on this back half of the house, what we're going to call the western portion of the house, These renovations would take decades, and that's then kind of where we're going to move into, is the decades of work that the Taylor family did in making this building livable. Now, one of the first things that they had to do was to remove the partitions that Perla had added in order to make rentable apartments. This is a picture of the playroom, and I circled on our floor plan here where the playroom is located, right here. And the playroom had one of those partitions right here. And this picture came from the Historic Structures Report, which is pretty stinking fantastic. The other thing that they had to do right away was to upgrade the electrical and the plumbing, particularly again on that western side. Now, right here, this is the west wall of the playroom. So it is this wall right here. Today, if you go through the little doorway on the west side of the playroom, it takes you into the big family room and the big sala grande. But when this photograph was taken, what was located on the other side of this wall was the courtyard. So that entire back half of the house hadn't even been built yet. So this is the exterior back courtyard of the site, which when I gave you the run through of the plans, I forgot to point that out, which is right here actually. This is today the back courtyard of the home. But at the time, this is where that house ended. So here's a side-by-side of the playroom then and the playroom now. The only kind of bummer about this is that I couldn't get a really good picture that lined up the west side and the west side. So here's that western wall of the playroom in the 1950s. Today, this is that western side of the playroom wall. So this is the door that you would go through that takes you into the sala grande. But you can just see how much work the family put into making that room what it is today and what you're going to get to see at some point in the future. So the wine room was still this separate freestanding building right here, right in the back, right here. And it was separate from the rest of the house. Like I said, it may have been a stable or some kind of storage room. And that back courtyard was much larger than it is today. This is going to be the kind of next key place that we want to talk about. This today is a bedroom, and it connects this northern portion of the home right here to the wine room. But at this time, when the family first moved in, this bedroom only had about a 4-foot wall on the north wall right here, and the rest of it was in ruins. So it wasn't even a usable location. And the doorway to get from that room and these two spaces right here were exterior doorways leading into the courtyard. This is that doorway today. And so we'll talk about when this all got added in, but you can see on the floor plan right over here, I've circled what the space you're looking at right here is. And so this is actually that bedroom. Today, we call this Paul and Mary's room, and for decades, this was the room that Paul and Mary lived in, but we're not there quite yet. But this was an exterior door that led into the back courtyard of the home. And in addition, the oratorio wall right here, or here, was an exterior wall. And so there's been a lot of changes to this house over time. This is the small zaguan. This is that hallway that I mentioned earlier, to where if you went straight through the large zaguan and into the inner courtyard, and then you go into this small zaguan to access the back rooms of the home, this is what it would look like if you were to kind of keep going straight through. So, in order to make these spaces connect, we had to extend that hallway. And so that is one of the first projects that Paul and Mary did, was to extend the small zaguan hallway so that it could connect back to these back spaces over here. So in order to do that, they did a couple of very cool things. The first thing that they did is they added this large territorial style window, and we can tell it's a territorial style window because of this triangular pedimented top of the window here. They added this window. So again, what we're looking at right here, I'll go back to kind of place you. This right here, this space right here where we're standing, if we made like a direct 90-degree turn, we would be facing that window right there. And so this, on the other side of the window, is the small zaguan. And then the other thing that they did is they added these two very large doors, and I apologize, I don't have a clear picture of the entire doorways. I really looked, but I don't. But I hope you can tell they're doors. They added these very large doors here that would go from the house into that back courtyard there. Now here's what's really cool about these doors. These doors were the original doors to the Barella store when the Barellas lived in the store. Now, the Taylor family, I should say Pat Taylor, as a matter of fact, told me that when the Taylor family moved into the home, those doors were in storage. And so at some point before the family moved in, maybe Perla, somebody had replaced the Barella store doors, and those doors were in storage. And so Paul and Mary were able to pull the doors out of storage and install them into the home, which today goes into the large family room, but at the time they installed these doors, exited into that large exterior courtyard. The other thing that they did is they ultimately took the doors to a carpenter in El Paso and had replica doors back on the Barella store. So the doors that we see on the Barella store today are replicas of the original doors that were on the Barella store back in the 19th century. The bedroom that I was referencing with that ruins on the north wall wasn't actually completed until 1960. This is that wall today. This is that north wall right here. And again, as I said, this is Paul and Mary's bedroom. But when the room was first finished, this was the TV room that the family used. And so what's very cool about this room is that these vigas right here, they came from the old Mesilla courthouse, and then these windows right here were actually salvaged from the Rualt house in Las Cruces. And so what's very cool about a lot of these spaces in the home is that they can tell us a lot about the different homes in Mesilla simply because the family reused those construction elements in the home. Okay, so we're going to skip ahead now to 1972. And in 1972, the family enclosed a portion of that back courtyard there. Here is that L section that I mentioned at the very beginning, creating a comfortable family room and a narrow chapel passageway. I'm quoting that directly from the Historic Structures Report. And this is the large Sala Grande, and this is the oratorio. What doing this allowed you to be able to do now is to actually make a full loop through the house. You can make a full circular loop through the house, go from the north side to the western side and into these back bedrooms here, or vice versa. So these spaces were added to the home in 1972. Two of the windows in the Sala Grande came from an early build of, and I don't know which windows, but two of the early windows came from an early build of the San Albino Church, and the rest of the windows were built to replicate those windows so that they could all matching what was an earlier version of the San Albino Church. The Vigas, they came from Nestor Armijo's adobe storerooms across the street from where Eicher's Furniture is now. And we'll skip ahead once again to 1982. And in 1982, Paul and Mary applied for and received a grant from the Historic Preservation Division with the state of New Mexico. And with this grant money, they were able to remove exterior plaster and re-stucco the home. They were able to repair the pitched tin roof framing, and they were also able to work on repairing the screens and windows as well as the wood trim and upgrading the electric. Now, if you came to part one, that sounds very similar to some of the work that we've been doing in the home over the last year in prepping for it to open, including repairing some of those window frames and the wood trim as well as upgrading the electric. Here's something cool, though, that came out of that. And as a matter of fact, it's kind of cool because our collections person, Yasmin, literally last week said, guess what I found? And I said, oh my gosh, you need to take a picture of this because this would be perfect for my talk next week. But during that 1982 preservation project, there were some archaeological finds that were found while doing that work. And so I've got some great photographs that Yasmin provided for us, and we also have some notes that Mike Taylor provided, which tells us a little bit about the copper spoon and the copper fork and the button that were found during this time period. According to Mike Taylor's notes, the spoon was found actually in the adobe wall. And how that probably happened is because the adobe bricks that were made, the dirt was probably grabbed from a dirt pile, and the spoon was probably in that dirt pile, and then it ended up in a brick, and then when they removed that damaged brick for this preservation project, they found the spoon. The fork itself was found in a plumbing hole, and then the button was found near the front door. The Reynolds store, on the other hand, in comparison to the family home as well as the Barella store, did not really require a lot of preservation work until about a decade ago when they had the floors completely redone. Over the years, the family has kept up with preservation work, very much under the watchful eye of Pat Taylor, who is a master abogado, as well as one of the world's leading authorities on adobe preservation work. This includes a project that was done about 4 years ago on the north wall of the home, where they had the plaster removed, damaged bricks replaced, and then the whole home was replastered. Whew, how was that, guys?
Great.
There has been a lot of work that's been done on the home over the years. And in any home, the work that you do is to make it livable and comfortable for yourself, and to make it a home with which you and your family are happy to live in. And that's exactly what the Taylor family did. They turned this into a home that they wanted to have for themselves and to have be comfortable. And that's actually a mandate that we have as a state of New Mexico. It's something that has been the family's express wishes, as well as is in the donation agreement, that it be a lived-in home. This includes that phenomenal Taylor family collection. So we're going to shift gears a little bit and do a giant flyover of the Taylor family collection, which spans styles, purpose, religion, value, and intent. And it not only creates that unique lived-in house museum, but it also creates an art museum that showcases local art and art from around the world. The art dates all the way back to the 17th century, including this very large, beautiful Mexican Baroque painting of San Miguel. This is in that sala, the parlor. This is a picture of the parlor that we saw earlier. If you were to do a full 180, you would be looking at the San Miguel painting. However, the collection really got its start when Paul Taylor was 5 years old with these two Maricopa pots that you see here, and here's a close-up of each of those pots. These pots are located in a back room of the house in this large glass-fronted cupboard, which came from the Armijo Gallagher family. So one of the things that the house allows us to do is to talk about even other families that are in the valley. These pots were gifts for Mr. Taylor from his aunt, Laura Evans. And his family is very prominent all throughout the home. It's through his mother, Maria Margarita Romero, that he's got these incredibly deep roots in New Mexico. His family can be traced back to a soldier on Coronado's expedition in 1540, as well as two of the original colonists who came in with an Oñate's Spanish entrada in 1598. That includes these two folks right here. This is Miguel Romero Ibaca and Josefa Delgado. They are two of the descendants of those original Spanish settlers with Oñate, and they are Paul's great-grandparents. Miguel Romero Ibaca was born in 1798. He was an early alcalde of Las Vegas, New Mexico. He was also a founder of the Republican Party of New Mexico, and Paul always liked to make the joke that the reason why he's got that scowl on his face is because he's a Republican and This is Josefa Delgado, and she was born in 1816. Her father, Manuel Salustiano Delgado, was a trader on the Santa Fe Trail, and family lore had it that he died in Kansas on the Santa Fe Trail and was temporarily buried in brandy-soaked burlap until he could be properly reinterred in Santa Fe. Mary Taylor liked to quip that he was Paul's pickled great-great-grand. These are two of their sons that you can see in the paintings and photographs next to them. This is Trinidad Romero. This is Paul Taylor's grandfather. And Trinidad Romero was actually one of the people who worked on the New Mexico Constitution when the state became a state in 1912. And then over here is their other son, A. Eugenio. Now, these paintings right here, there's actually two sets of these paintings that were done. One was given to Trinidad and one was given to A. Eugenio. We have the set that was given to Trinidad, and the New Mexico History Museum in Santa Fe has the set that was given to A. Eugenio. And as the daughter of a firefighter, the other fun fact I like to give out about A. Eugenio is that he built the first fire station in New Mexico. Here is the sala. You can see in the back there the giant painting of San Miguel, but what I want to point out in the back is this chair right here. This is Mrs. Barella's chair. This is possibly the thing that's called this building home the longest. This belonged to her, and after she died, it went to Manuel Valles, who was the bell ringer at San Albino for 50 years. And Mr. Taylor remembered this chair being in Mr. Valles' room when he was older. And after Mr. Valles passed away, he asked what happened to the chair, and the chair had broken and was in a burn pile, and he asked if he could have the chair. And he brought the chair back and fixed up the chair and put it back in the home where it originally belonged. One of the very cool things about the home is that it does provide us the opportunity to talk about the history of Mesilla, just like Mrs. Barella's chair. Some of these things we can talk about include this nicho right here, which was done by Father Grange. Father Grange is an avid woodworker. We have several pieces of his woodworking at the home. He is also the one who carved the high altar in the San Albino Church. We have the set of andirons right here that belonged to the Barella family, and this is one candlestick and a set of candlesticks that came from San Albino Church. And then right here we have this tin mirror. This is not a Southern New Mexican tin mirror. This is actually done by an artist out of Santa Fe. But the decorative style of this is a painting style that came out of the Mesilla Valley and is in fact called Mesilla Cone decorative. The tin artwork in the house is phenomenal, and this brings us the ability to talk about the Works Progress Administration, which was a New Deal program that FDR installed. And there was a section of the Works Progress Administration that helped artists to revive some of these art styles, particularly here in New Mexico. Now, one story that I really do want to tell about this before we move on is a while back I took a virtual tour of the Taylor home to a local elementary school, and what I did is I showed pictures of the room and asked the kids if you can maybe guess why the room is called the room. And so I showed them this picture and said, why do you think the tin room is called the tin room? And a bunch of hands shot up and they said, well, because Oscar the Grouch lives in a tin trash can. I mean, they're not wrong. But we call this the tin room because there's all of this wonderful tin here on the wall. The tin work that's done was a part of what was called the Spanish Colonial Revival. There was a lot of different art styles that were revived during this period. We actually have a few pieces that date to the Spanish colonial era, which is 1598 until the Mexican independence. And a few of these pieces include these two chairs, as well as this table right here, and this cupboard. In addition, we have furniture that dates to the Spanish Colonial Revival period, that WPA era. In this chair right here, there's a couple of these chairs, but I think this is the same chair. But you can see this beautiful stepped design work on the back of the chair. This unpainted design that you see in the furniture is pretty common throughout the house. We don't just see it in the furniture, we also see it in the religious art, particularly in the santos, which are devotional images of saints. This is actually one of the oldest living traditions in Hispanic American art. And we have bultos in the house, which are three-dimensional images of saints, as well as retablos, which are two-dimensional images of saints. And you can see some of the unpainted wood pieces in the santos that we have in the house. And in the 18th century, New Mexican artists were developing a very distinctive santo style, and they were called santeros. Which brings me to another very cool interpretive opportunity that we have at the house, and that is artists who pass their trade and craft, however you say that, down through the generations to their children and their children's children. The art that we see here was done by George Lopez and Sabanita Lopez Ortiz, who are two generations of the very famed Cordova, School of Cordova, up in northern New Mexico. But they're not the only family that we have in the house that was doing it. The tin work, this is 5 generations of Delgado family tin work on this wall. And so we have the ability to talk about all of the various families who brought their craft into the present. Which brings me to what is possibly the most important santo that we have in the house, Santiago. This is arguably Mr. Taylor's favorite piece in the collection. This is just a really beautiful story, and one that he wouldn't let anyone who came in the house leave without telling, so I feel it very important to tell right now. He used to go up to Albuquerque every year for the New Mexico Educators Association conference, and he would go to this antique shop where he would see this santo on display. And one year, the owner of that shop told him that if you're going to buy this piece, you probably want to do it now because we're going to be upping our prices. And he told her that he didn't have the ability to spend the $90 asking price on this piece. And she said, well, do you have $5 that you can put a down payment on and then pay me $5 every month? And he gave her $5 and proceeded to start leaving the store. And she said, well, why aren't you taking your Santiago? And he said, I didn't pay for it. I gave you $5. Don't I need to pay for it? And what she told him is that anybody who's come here year after year and looked at the Santiago can be trusted to send $5 every month until it's paid off. So, how in the world are we supposed to tell all of these amazing stories and interpret the history of this home with only an hour-long tour when there's so many other things in the home that we haven't even gotten a chance to talk to? How are we supposed to do that? It seems like an impossible task. That's where what this historic site can become suddenly becomes very, very interesting. Now, I hope over these last 2 talks that I've presented to you, I've been able to make it clear that Mesilla and this historic site are beautiful reminders that though things change over time, the places where people live and work and play and worship, they provide stability for a community. In 2006, J. Paul Taylor stated that this donation is a lasting tribute to the feelings that the family has for the town of Mesilla. This historic site is set to become a place where the traditions of generations of New Mexico will be preserved and cared for, and generations to come can share their story and take part in those traditions. Here's the thing about house museums. House museums are sometimes referred to as memory museums. They seek to collect and preserve the traces and memories of the people who used to call those places home. Museum professionals, we have a narrative that we tell in these house museums, whether that be of the family or the significant person who lived there, the period of time in which that family lived, or the social structure that existed around that. Rooms in these houses, they're generally roped off, and you can't actually go into these spaces. In addition, they're staged to look like they would look in, like, let's say 1867. Visitors to the home, they'll hear a little bit about that notable person or the family that lived there, some of the experiences they may have had, but the rooms remain off limits, and the experiences that we as visitors have to that historic site, they remain separate from the experiences of the family that exists there. In recent years, museum professionals have been working very hard to broaden the picture of what a house museum can be. And by the nature of the donation agreement that the Taylor family has with the state of New Mexico, that is actually what is called for at the Taylor-Mesilla Historic Site. As we've seen in the renovations that have been done throughout the house, doors and windows and light fixtures and other construction elements have actually been reused to create the property that we see today. And per museum standards, particularly the Secretary of Interior's standards, it's not all that recommended for a lot of house museums. But this is a practice that's incredibly common here in New Mexico and all across the Southwest. Reconciling these traditional museum practices with a traditional New Mexico home is what our job is to do here at the Taylor-Mesilla Historic Site. That is what we have to do. Homes are not static things. They're just not. None of our homes that we've lived in over our lives tell a singular snapshot of our lives. My house that I grew up in, I was 5 and 10 and 17 and 22 in that house. And my bedroom didn't look the same between 5 and 10 and 17 and 22. It changed and grew with me as I grew over time. My parents still live in that house, but I don't actually live in that house anymore. But when I went to visit them recently, that's the exact same room that I stayed in. It's not my room anymore, but for those 8 days, it certainly was my room. It still has the antique desk that I used when I lived in that house, which actually belonged to my dad's grandparents. It has a new bed in it. It has a new, new paint in the room. It even has a giant stuffed moose that I crocheted last year. But it's not my room anymore. My memories of that space may remain, but it's changed. And I actually think that that's a really beautiful thing. This is how the Taylor-Mesilla Historic Site is different. We don't have to tell a singular snapshot in time at the house. We don't have to tell just the Taylor family stories. This can remain a living house, one that changes and adapts with the different people that come into it and all of the preservation and additions that the Taylor family has done over time, in addition to the incredible art collection. We can host tours that talk just about the paintings or just about the religious art or just about the Taylor family or Mesilla history. This isn't going to be a historic site that you can come to just one time and say, oh, I've already gone there, I don't need to go that again. We want you to come back again and again and again and to be able to learn something new every single time you come. We want this to be a place where the memories of the generations who came before get preserved, but also our own. If you've ever been in that house, your memories are a part of that house's story. With the donation of the home and the work that the state of New Mexico is currently doing in the home, we are ensuring that this house continues to be a living thing. In 2004, New Mexico State University conducted oral history interviews with all of the members of the Taylor family. And there's a quote that Robert Taylor, who's the oldest of the Paul and Mary's 7 children, said, which I really love. He said, "This house is like a member of the family. It's probably the oldest member of the family." Paul and Mary made a very conscious decision to raise their family in Mesilla, and that family has left us their home. A home that has changed over time, but it's always been a home, even to its earliest days. And one that will continue to be a home long after any of us are here. This home, it represents the beauty and the magic that New Mexico has to offer through its history and the many cultures that are represented through the art, but also through the architecture of the home. Do you guys have any questions for me? That's all I have for you today.